He said, I read your book. He said, and let me tell you one thing. He says, we're never going to let someone tell us where we can or can't bomb.
Abraham Lincoln Bookshop. Think of us as Lincoln's Chicago address.
General Wesley Clark, you're here at the Abraham Lincoln Bookshop in Chicago. What do you think about the virtual book signing idea?
Well, I'm excited about it. And Dan says people could be coming in from all over the world. And I'll get to autograph books for them. It's pretty exciting. It's a pretty exciting bookstore, by the way. I don't know if you had a chance to look around, but there's everything here. There's wonderful old prints and great books, and especially stuff about Lincoln and the Civil War and the Civil War generals. And I'm very taken with it. I'm sorry that all the people who might be online aren't here to see it.
Did you see already the books that have come in and sold and are ready to be autographed?
Well, he didn't explain what those were, but it looks very impressive. Good.
You, so.
Great.
All right.
I'm thrilled.
Winston Churchill famously said that the only thing worse than fighting a war with allies is fighting without them. And in light of your experience with them and the current events in the Mideast, which you have an interest in, what do you think of the state of coalition warfare and for the future of it?
Yeah. Well, Winston Churchill was prophetic in that statement, as in all others. I went in to see Don Rumsfeld right after 9/11. It was about 10 days afterwards. I mentioned it briefly in the book. And he had a copy of my book, my first book, Waging Modern War, on his desk. He said, I read your book. He said, and let me tell you one thing. He says, we're never going to let someone tell us where we can or can't bomb. He said, so I'm thinking we'll do this we won't do it with NATO. We'll do, and he's talking about attacking Afghanistan or something. We'll do it as a floating coalition. What do you think about that concept? I said, well, Mr. Secretary, I just gotten out of the Army, been out of the Army a year. I was in with a powerful Secretary of Defense. I was in awe of him. And before I could finish my thought, he said, well, we're out of time, that's it. He talked to Paul, and he sent me off to see the Secretary of Defense, Deputy Secretary of Defense. What I was going to try to tell him is that the floating coalition concept is a bad idea. It's a bad idea. What you have in NATO is an alliance in which one nation pledges to another that any security threat against that one nation will be a security threat against all nations. It's the strongest commitment one nation can make to another. And if you can hold nations together with that kind of bond, you can face any threat successfully. We did it in the campaign against Slobodan Milosevic. Mm-hmm. I described this in the book. And it was a painful campaign. Winston Churchill was right. I memean, it was awful. We had Spanish, French, Germans, Brits, Americans. Everybody was in there. The Hungarians, the Hungary joined a week before the attack. And I get the ambassador from Hungary comes in to say, my prime minister has sent me to see you with an urgent message. I said, okay, what's that? He said, you must not lose. He said, twice before in this century, Hungary has joined an alliance and gone to war. And in both cases, Hungary lost and was dismembered. And so you get pressures from heads of state on military leaders. People are nervous, people are worried, and they're pulling at each other and tearing at the military at the same time. Churchill was right. It's a tough experience. But the advantage of it is that you can swing a lot of diplomatic clout and leverage that's far more powerful ultimately in winning a war than the military forces themselves, in most cases. I mean, World War II was an exception. But in the case of the battle against Slobodan Milosevic, we won that without ever losing an American soldier, airman, marine, or a sailor. And we did it because we had the united force of NATO and all these nations who essentially cut off any possibility for Milosevic of wriggling out of his dilemma. And
of course,
so he recognized he couldn't possibly win. That's the advantage of an alliance.
Of course, politics gets into these alliances, even though they're
Every
foreign.
alliance is about politics.
And then, exactly. And there are pressures, even in that, to maybe fall away at times as well. Is it difficult to keep them there, then?
Sure. I mean, you have to understand that you want your allies to be democracies rather than dictatorships, presumably, because that's what we believe in. And yet, if they're democracies, it means that the man in charge has to listen to his own public opinion. And so you have to be sensitive to the public opinion in these states. And that is itself a challenge, especially for apparently this administration. who hasn't been sensitive to public opinion in Turkey or France or Germany.